Walk outside tonight and look at the lights in your city. Every single one of them is a bet. A bet that the oil is still moving, that the tankers are still sailing, that a waterway 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, a strait so thin you could drive across it in less time than it takes to watch this video, is still open for business. For most of the world, that bet has always been terrifying. Because in 2025, when the war in Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, roughly a third of all the oil that moves by sea simply stopped moving. Prices detonated, economies seized. Ministers called emergency sessions. And China had already left the building. You heard that right. The world's largest energy importer, the country that was importing roughly half its oil from the Middle East, nearly all of it through that same choke point, barely flinched. And that is just the beginning. But here is the part that blows people's minds. It was not luck. It was not geography. It was not even a reaction to the crisis. This was a decade-long engineering project, executed in plain sight, designed for exactly the storm that just hit. If this is the kind of story that makes you rethink everything you thought you knew about global power, hit a quick like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. By the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly how China quietly engineered the world's most dangerous choke point into something it no longer needs to fear. The choke point that held the world hostage. Picture a garden hose, one hose, and every drop of water your entire household depends on runs through it. Now picture someone else's hand on the nozzle. That was China's energy situation for the better part of 2 decades. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles across at its narrowest point. It sits between Oman and Iran. And at any given moment, roughly a third of all the liquefied natural gas traded globally, and about 20% of all the oil in the world passes through it. For China specifically, the number was even more concentrated. Roughly half of all the oil Beijing imported came from the Persian Gulf, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the UAE, Kuwait, and almost all of it came back through that same 21-mile bottleneck. Now, here's what makes this a problem unlike almost any other in geopolitics. China has the world's second largest economy. It has the world's largest standing army. It has the world's most ambitious naval expansion program running right now, but it cannot project naval power into the Persian Gulf in any meaningful way. The United States Fifth Fleet is based in Bahrain. American carrier groups operate in the Gulf routinely. In any scenario where the strait closes, whether by Iranian mines, by missile, by military blockade, China's Navy arrives too late, operates too far from home, and cannot reopen it. The economists who modeled this scenario for Beijing came back with numbers that kept officials awake at night. A prolonged Hormuz closure would hit Chinese manufacturing within weeks, not months, within weeks. Because the inventory buffers for oil, the strategic reserves, the floating storage, the pipeline capacity are measured in days to low double-digit weeks, not in the kind of multi-month cushion that would give diplomacy time to work. One shipping analyst who briefed Beijing's Energy Security Council in 2012 reportedly described the strait as a gun pointed at the Chinese economy that China had no way to move out of the way. Here is the brutal catch. The only other land routes that could partially substitute the pipelines through Central Asia, the Myanmar-Yunnan corridor, were either insufficient in capacity, politically fragile, or both. China was threading oil through a needle it did not own, could not protect, and could not replace at speed. Every year the economy grew, the needle got smaller. And the rest of the world knew it. Energy analysts wrote about it, intelligence services tracked it, hedge funds bet on it. The Strait of Hormuz was widely understood as the single most exploitable vulnerability of the country that was otherwise becoming the most powerful nation on Earth. What nobody predicted was that Beijing would decide not to argue about the needle. It would make the needle irrelevant. But the decision to walk away from that vulnerability did not start with solar panels. It started with a calculation about risk that most governments refuse to make honestly, and that story begins somewhere most people never look. The calculation Beijing made that nobody else would. Most governments, when they identify a strategic vulnerability, write a report about it. They form a committee. They fund a study. They schedule a follow-up meeting about the findings of the study. Beijing did something different. It treated the vulnerability like an engineering problem with a known solution set, assigned it a budget, and started building. Think of it like a building code. Most cities write fire codes after a fire. Beijing looked at the Hormuz choke point, modeled what a fire would look like, and quietly rewrote the structural requirements before anything was burning. The period from 2014 to 2016 is where the story actually begins. And here is what most people get wrong about it. China's early solar deployment in those years made no economic sense on the surface. The cost of utility-scale solar was still coming down steeply. The grid integration technology was immature. Western analysts at the time read China's aggressive panel manufacturing and domestic installation numbers as industrial policy, a play to dominate the global supply chain for photovoltaic cells, undercut Western manufacturers, and capture export markets. That reading was correct, but it was incomplete, because running alongside the industrial logic was a second logic entirely. Every gigawatt of solar installed inside China's borders was one less gigawatt that had to be generated by burning fuel that arrived through a choke point China could not defend. The geopolitical cost of oil, the insurance premium, the carrier group that needs to exist, the diplomatic relationship that needs to be maintained, the reserve that needs to be held never shows up on an energy invoice, but it is real, and it is enormous. Chinese planners appear to have decided to account for it explicitly. And once you add that hidden cost back in, the economics of domestic renewables stopped looking marginal and started looking like a bargain. Now, here is the part that puts everything into perspective. The 2022 global energy crisis triggered by the war in Ukraine, by European gas market dislocation, by a world suddenly reminded that energy security is not a solved problem, did not slow China's program, it doubled it. Beijing used that crisis as evidence, as confirmation, as permission to compress what had been a decade-long deployment schedule into 5 years. Investment in renewables inside China surged. The targets got bigger, the timelines got shorter. And the thing that made all of it possible was not just the solar panels. It was what Beijing built to make the electricity from those panels actually reach the places that needed it. Because there is a gap between generating clean power in the middle of a desert and running it into a coastal factory city, and closing that gap required something just as ambitious as the generation build-out itself. But a revolutionary new energy source is only half of the equation. The other half is invisible to most people, and it is the piece that actually made the Hormuz closure survivable. The grid that nobody talks about. Here is a fact that does not make the news, but probably should. China's best wind and solar resources are almost entirely in the wrong places. Imagine filling a bathtub, but the tap is in the garage. Xinjiang, Gansu, Inner Mongolia, the Gobi Desert. These are the provinces with the sun and the wind. But the factories are in Guangdong. The cities are on the coast. The load, the actual demand for electricity, is thousands of miles east, where the manufacturing belts run 24 hours a day, and where a power interruption translates almost immediately into export delays, production losses, and economic damage that ripples outward. For years, this geographic mismatch was China's renewable energy problem. The panels went up, the turbines turned, and enormous quantities of electricity were simply wasted, curtailed, in the technical language, because there was no way to move the power from where it was generated to where it was needed. In some years, curtailment rates in Gansu province reached 30% or higher. The sun was generating power that vanished because the wire to carry it did not exist. What China built to solve this problem is called ultra-high voltage direct current transmission, UHVDC. The engineering is extraordinary. These are lines carrying electricity at voltages above 800 kilovolts. Think of it as a superhighway for electrons, running at speeds and volumes that conventional transmission infrastructure cannot match. A single UHVDC corridor can carry the equivalent output of several large power stations across a distance of over 1,000 miles, with losses that are dramatically lower than traditional alternating current lines over the same distance. China now operates more UHVDC lines than the rest of the world combined. The Gansu corridor, specifically the backbone of the Western generation to Eastern consumption link, is not one line. It is a network. multiple corridors, multiple voltage levels, redundancy built in. When analysts look at China's power grid today versus what existed 10 years ago, they are looking at a fundamentally different infrastructure. The bathtub now has a tap that works. Here is what makes this incredibly exciting from an energy security standpoint. The grid modernization program did not just connect supply to demand, it created resilience. Because power flowing in from multiple Western provinces over multiple corridors means that no single disruption, no single weather event, no single equipment failure, and critically, no single fuel supply interruption can knock out the whole system. You would have to break the grid in multiple places simultaneously to replicate the kind of shock that a Hormuz closure used to be able to deliver automatically. By the time 2025 arrived, the architecture was in place. The generation was running. The transmission was carrying it. And the industrial East Coast, the place where a power crisis would do the most economic damage, was drawing electricity from sources that had never seen the inside of a tanker. But here is the thing. As extraordinary as all of that infrastructure was, it still did not solve the hardest problem. What happens when the sun goes down? The facility that stores the sun stands in the Gobi Desert at midnight on a clear summer night. There is no sunlight. There is no wind worth mentioning. And yet, in Dunhuang, a city on the ancient Silk Road in Gansu province, there is a power plant running. Not on stored battery charge, not on backup diesel, on heat. Specifically, on heat that was captured from the sun 10 hours ago and is still hot enough right now to boil water, spin turbines, and feed electricity into a grid serving millions of people. The Dunhuang Solar Thermal Complex is the kind of facility that tends to stay out of Western media coverage, which is unfortunate because it is one of the most strategically significant energy installations on Earth. 12,000 mirrors heliostats arranged in concentric rings around a central tower. Each mirror tracks the sun with precision across the full arc of the day. The sunlight they focus heats a fluid. That fluid heats molten salt. The molten salt stores the thermal energy with remarkable efficiency. And because salt stays hot genuinely, stubbornly hot, holding temperature, the way a cast iron pan holds heat long after you have turned off the burner, the electricity generation does not stop when the sun sets. You heard that right, 12,000 mirrors. To put that in perspective, if you laid those mirrors end to end, they would stretch further than the entire island of Manhattan is long, and then some. And they do not just generate daytime power, they generate around-the-clock power, the kind of power a grid can actually rely on. The kind of power that does not require a tanker sailing through a contested strait. Now, here is the detail that engineers do not always advertise. Dunhuang is not an experiment. It is not a pilot project. It is one of 18 solar thermal facilities now operational across China, with a dozen more under construction. What began as a demonstration of technology has become a deployment program. And the cumulative storage capacity building up across those facilities represents something genuinely new in the global energy picture: dispatchable renewable power at industrial scale, available on demand, independent of weather, independent of fuel imports, independent of any waterway anyone can close. The IEA's data on China's wind and solar deployment tells a striking story. The combined scale-up of those two technologies in the 5 years running up to 2025 exceeded everything China had built in the entire preceding decade. That is not linear growth. That is an acceleration. And it happened precisely in the window when China's strategic planners had identified the Hormuz vulnerability as their primary energy security exposure. The geometry of the timing is hard to dismiss as coincidence. If China building 12,000 mirrors in the Gobi surprised you, the next part is going to be even harder to believe. Hit subscribe so you're there when we cover it. The moment the strait closed and the world held its breath. In 2025, the crisis that energy analysts had been modeling for a decade finally arrived. The details of the military conflict in Iran are beyond the scope of this video. What matters here is the economic transmission mechanism, the sequence of cause and effect that turned a military event in the Persian Gulf into a global energy crisis within 72 hours. The strait closed, Tanker traffic stopped. Spot oil prices moved in ways that the market had not seen since the worst days of the 1970s. Importing nations that had not diversified, had not built storage, had not run the scenario in anything other than a theoretical model found themselves staring at the real version. Europe scrambled. Japan scrambled. South Korea scrambled. Emergency sessions were called. Strategic reserves were tapped. The conversations that typically happen over months happened over days. And here is what happened in China. The oil price shock hit. China is not fully insulated from global oil markets. It still imports oil, still has a transportation sector running on liquid fuels, still has petrochemical industries that need crude. The economy felt the price movement. Anyone who tells you China was completely unaffected is wrong, and this script will not tell you that. But here is the part nobody talks about. The transmission pathway that in every previous oil shock had turned an oil price spike into an electricity price spike, into an industrial production cost spike, into a consumer inflation spiral. That pathway was broken because China's electricity grid by 2025 was no longer meaningfully coupled to oil. The backbone of industrial power, the stuff running the factories, the data centers, the manufacturing belts, was coming from wind farms in Inner Mongolia, solar installations in Xinjiang, thermal storage plants in Gansu. The Hormuz closure hit those sectors the way a flooded road hits a driver who took a different highway years ago. The flood was real. The disruption was real. But it was someone else's problem. Now, here is the part that puts everything into perspective. The competitor analysis of this story described China's renewables as having helped stabilize electricity prices during the crisis. That is accurate. But it understates the mechanism by so much that it almost describes a different event. Stabilizing prices implies a cushion, a buffer, something that absorbed a shock that still arrived. What actually happened was structural. The channel through which the shock would have traveled had been closed off, not dampened, closed. China had not built a thicker wall. It had moved the building out of the flood zone. The factories kept running. The grid kept supplying. The industrial output continued. And the rest of the world noticed in the way you only notice an absence when the presence it replaced is suddenly and painfully obvious everywhere else. But understanding what China survived is only half the picture. The more important question, the one that energy strategists and geopolitical analysts are now arguing about in rooms most people will never enter, is what this means for the world going forward. What the world just learned and cannot unlearn. History has a habit of marking turning points only in retrospect. The moment a technology became dominant, the moment a power shifted, the moment the old rules stopped applying. Usually, you only recognize those moments years later, when the evidence has accumulated enough to be undeniable. The Hormuz closure of 2025 may be one of those moments, and the reason is not the war. Wars in the Middle East are not new. Oil disruptions are not new. The reason is what the crisis revealed about the divergence between the economies that had prepared and the economies that had not, and the fact that, for the first time in the history of the global oil order, the world's largest energy consumer was in the prepared column. Think about what that actually means. The Strait of Hormuz has functioned as a lever for as long as the modern oil economy has existed. It is the reason the United States maintains a naval presence in the Gulf. It is the reason Gulf states have had geopolitical leverage disproportionate to their size. It is the reason every importing nation on Earth has had to maintain diplomatic relationships, military alliances, and strategic reserve stockpiles calibrated around the risk of closure. It is not just an oil route. It is one of the fundamental load-bearing structures of the post-war international order. And China just demonstrated that it has, to a remarkable degree, stopped needing to worry about it. Here is what makes this so extraordinary. This was not achieved by military superiority. China did not build a fleet that can guarantee Hormuz stays open. It did not negotiate a security arrangement that removes the risk. It did not find oil somewhere else. It re-engineered the domestic economy so that the oil passing through Hormuz became less critical to the functions the economy most needs to protect industrial production, electricity generation, manufacturing output. It solved a geopolitical problem with an engineering solution. Now, here is the detail that puts everything into perspective. Every other major importing economy, Europe, Japan, South Korea, India, still runs on the same fundamental dependency that China just spent a decade dismantling. Some are further along in their transitions than others. None are where China is. And the gap, which was already real before the 2025 crisis, is now visible in a way that cannot be ignored. The crisis did not create the gap. It measured it, out loud, in front of everyone. The question every energy minister in every major importing nation is now asking is not whether to replicate China's program. They are already trying. The question is whether they can close a decade-long head start in the time window that remains, and whether they have the institutional capacity, the capital mobilization, and frankly the political will to do what Beijing did, to treat an energy transition not as an environmental aspiration, but as a national security obligation. To account for the geopolitical cost of oil honestly, and let that accounting drive infrastructure investment at the kind of scale that most democratic governments find very difficult to execute. The answer to that question is still being written. And the answer matters because a world in which China has decoupled from the Hormuz lever while everyone else remains attached to it is a world in which the balance of vulnerability has shifted in a way that has no modern precedent. What China built in the Gobi Desert, across the transmission corridors of the West, inside the molten salt tanks of Dunhuang, and along the 1,000 miles of ultra-high voltage lines connecting generation to consumption, all of it was described, as it was being built, as an environmental program, a climate commitment, a green energy transition, and some of it genuinely was. But the part that mattered most, in the moment that mattered most, was something else entirely. It was the most methodically executed energy security operation in modern history. The Strait of Hormuz did not become irrelevant to China because the war ended. It became irrelevant because China built the world it needed before the war arrived to test it. If this changed how you think about the global energy order, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Now I want to hear from you in the comments. Do you think the rest of the world can close the gap with China's energy transition in time? Or has China already locked in a permanent strategic advantage that no one else can catch?